haven't allowed to do that. Yes, I'm not quite sure how to frame that question. If others have ideas about something better, but I guess what I was wondering about was, sometimes when Joe will say tweet something, and I feel as if, gosh, that's a thing that I would like actually to be out there, and it's like fly catching a little bit, because you sort of see who responds to it, or sometimes there's maybe a more strategic political thing, sort of like, I'm just thinking specifically about the Greenbelt in Toronto, where there was just a ton of protest, public sort of outrage. And it's like, okay, that's like a fire is here. Let's help blow the flames on that fire, because it's actually, there needs to be attention on it. And then sort of very strategically start dropping the bioregional conversation into that, because they're ripe and ready to hear those messages. So it's kind of like sort of being attuned to what's going out in the world. And actually, you know what, I think that's the way that I wanted to kind of bring that in, was that's how I feel like I operate anyway in my bioregion, is kind of paying attention to the ground. What are the things that people are paying attention to and are interested in? And I need to be kind of immersed in that space, even if I'm maybe not even making that much noise, is just so that when the appropriate time comes, people know me enough, are familiar enough, there's some trust, and you have the opportunity to be heard at a sort of more strategically important time. So I think that's kind of the context. And so I just wondered if others had something to add to that. I really appreciated hearing about Preston, you're using Mastodon, if that's being effective. If there are other platforms that you've found. I don't want to get really busy. I hate having 1,000 different places to look. And I keep hearing LinkedIn, and I've absolutely hated LinkedIn just because of my experiences in the past, but maybe I need to get over that. So it's kind of like, okay, what should we be encouraging? What should we do as our top list of things in priority order to sort of be paying attention to? That's what I would love to hear from others.
Yeah, I'm seeing Pamela's hand for maybe just a bit of clarification, Claire. I'm wondering, so are you suggesting that we try to make a more of a coordinated effort to be able to respond together in a particular social media platform? Or I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the nuances of your question.
I'm not so sure, but I don't know that everybody wants more to pay attention to. It's maybe just a conversation, because the people that are going to be attuned to that are going to pick up on it. It's just that I don't typically have this conversation, but I'm with a group of people who are all paying attention and passionate about the same kind of things. So I'd love to hear what people are doing, how much energy they put into it, and for me, it was just useful hearing what Preston had to share. And for my own sharing, I would say that that Twitter has been useful, but I don't know about other platforms. And then there are, just in terms of other communications, I will sometimes get things into, there's an interfaith newsletter communique that I will sometimes have put things into that get the messages out there. I don't, unless I've got something that I know really speaks to that community, because it's like getting the right audience and the people that are open to hearing what you've got to say. That's where I put my energy. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't advise.
Yeah, Pamela.
I'm surprised I'm interested in this, Claire, because we're so pervaded with social media that I find myself just finding strategies to minimize and avoid it. And yet at the same time, I also find myself embedded in certain kinds of things that are actually very useful. And right now, for me in this context, Facebook is one of the places where it seems, because this is an older population, there's more activity in this community, which has links with Facebook. And yeah, that has been invisible to me, how I use that. Like, it's something, what you're saying raises in my consciousness or awareness that I have an opportunity to, dropping the bioregional conversation is what got me, to start planting seeds into that, a couple of the spaces that I'm in here that start to bring out bioregionalism, and in particular story of place, or the spirit of place, because that framework is a much easier sort of entry point for people to start thinking about where they are in a broader context. Twitter scares the dickens out of me, so other people can do that one, but and so with the others. But I think that given the context I'm in and how Facebook has a kind of use, that's really, thank you, Claire, for bringing that up and taking me a step further in my understanding.
Well, Preston, excited to hear from you with all your Twitter experience.
So first, I think it's really, really important to touch on the mental health issues and all the problematic aspects that this all entails. I think it's an area we have to be very careful about. Now, from the perspective of being new to Earth Regenerators actively, it sort of keeps on bouncing around in my mind as well. And so what I did, I think, over the last 2 days after being fairly active new onto Mastodon, I'm brand new to it as of December. I wanted to be able to frame a little bit more about Earth Regenerators and how I got to this point in my life with a trail of events that has brought me here. And so I rewrote my bio to kind of reflect that a little bit. Because what I have found over the last couple of years is, for example, the topic of indigeneity, indigenousness, voices, people, organizations. There's so much information that's propaganda that is intended to do damage, is intended to cause division. I've been following the Wet'suwet'en issues in BC for a few years now, and being embedded in an organization, Decolonial Solidarity, where I got to see a lot of the moving pieces, the parts, the different sides of those perspectives and how they come together. It occurred to me that it takes a lot of time and energy to sort of curate anything useful from, at that point, Twitter, but I think Mastodon and other social media falls into the same category. And so it's, I think what I was interested in from Claire's perspective and being new is having some aspect of sort of I don't want to overstep who I am interacting with my following or the people I'm searching for about what Earth Regenerators is exactly. And so to misrepresent that to a community that I'm trying to possibly bring into the conversation a little bit more. And so the idea of having an aspect of a social media toolkit of just sort of framing things a little bit here and there as to how to couch those conversations a little bit, to not misrepresent things, to keep it within a framework that is conducive to a lot of what is in the podcast, in Joe's video comments, all those types of things. And so I've been playing around a little bit with that, posting a few of them out there, but careful not to try to do too much of it or to, so yeah, that's sort of where I'm at on that whole aspect of it. LinkedIn, I post a little bit, but more because I think there's a group of people that could be sort of pulled out of the delusion of green growth, that start to see that it doesn't work quite the way they thought it does. A lot of people in academia that are sort of, riding a journey of the system is corrupted and broken, but, we're still surviving it, who's falling out of those sorts of frameworks and those perspectives, and who we might be able to bring some of their energies and their networks into this type of framework. So anyway, what I'm saying is there's very specific strategies I use in a few little pockets, and it's something I think we have to be careful about how much energy we dump into.
Well, thank you for the wisdom that's come from experience. Yeah, Meaty, on to you.
Well, I love, Preston, that you kind of prefaced this with the whole thing about mental health. We had a really interesting chat, which I had to leave early yesterday, about sovereignty in Campfire. And I'm really clear that I am a sovereign being at the same time as being totally interconnected with everything else that's going on. And I live with that paradox. But I'm very clear that I am responsible for my mental health and well-being. And that's the point at which I start to relate to social media. What I've learned about myself is that I have zero personal tolerance for, isn't it terrible that so-and-so and such is going on? Those kind of dialogues, I do not even need to know that they're going on. And over the last 2 or 3 years, I think I've become really comfortable at realizing that I just don't get engaged. They don't figure, because I've recognized in myself that I don't have any contribution to make to those kind of conversations, and they only get my own nervous system tense and on edge. They don't feature anymore. So there are all kinds of things that go on that kind of at the edge of my identity, I'm aware that people are talking about that don't happen in my world, and I'm the healthier because of it. And I really believe that that's because of my conscious choice that I don't need to be there. And at the same time, I'm aware that it has released in me, or perhaps I always had, a natural scanning gift, that I tend to know what's happening that's important, the kind of important events. Like, I'll give you a little example. I don't know who is aware of the existence of a being called Andrew Tate. But a being called Andrew Tate unprovoked, goaded the climate activist Greta Thunberg. And I picked that up before it became a story of the goad exploding in his own face and him getting arrested as a result of it. I seem to have this capacity to know when something is important in the collective, an event, and notice it and then see it unravel. And I call it, in my own sphere, I call it I'm looking for green shoots. I have a bias when I'm exploring social media. I want to know the good stuff that is an indication that actually we're evolving as a species. There's plenty of stuff that will tell me we're in devolution mode, but I'm not interested in that, because my reason for being on this planet is to support evolution to a higher frequency. That's my job. I don't always do it very well, but that's my job. So I look on social media for what are the indicators that things are happening. And it's brought me into such a healthy relationship with social media. And from that point of view, I want to go to a very grounded operational perspective, because what I saw happening in a particular part of the ER universe that I'm very directly engaged with at the end of last year was a kind of burgeoning of communication channels. And that's the Vivero communication channel network. And I just want to show you, I'm going to share a link, and I'm going to ask you to, it's actually the only link I can offer you because I didn't generate the document. I'm going to ask you to please treat this, and I see everybody in this room as being an incredibly trustworthy individual who will treat this as a view-only mechanism because it's a working document within Vivero. And I'm putting it into the link, into the chat now, and it's a link to just show you what we're doing within Vivero to try and make sense of the many channels that we're engaged in, and to try to begin to bring some clarity to where are we engaging, how are we engaging, and what's the purpose of our engaging in different places in order for us to be able to communicate together much more effectively. So I'm sharing this with you as a kind of information resource. I would really ask you not to inhabit it. Although if you do feel really strongly called, if this is something that has you saying, I've got to make my input, then I also trust that. But I ask you to make it as a comment rather than as an edit, and to name yourself rather than as kind of anonymous rhino or whoever you might appear as when you make the comment. But I want to show you the kind of, this is where I feel what Benji was talking about earlier about Earth regenerators coming to ground and becoming a much more embodied, it sounds silly to say it, down-to-earth vehicle, and yet this is a practical down-to-earth document. It's a grounded document for saying, where do we do what? How do we do what? What's our purpose? In an incredibly complex cat's cradle form of communication channel. So I hope that's of interest and speaks somehow, at least peripherally, to what Claire was inspiring us to contribute to. Thank you.
I'm wondering if anybody would like to respond to what Meaty just brought in. I did have a comment on social media and our use of it, but at this point, I kind of feel like we've gone in a different direction a little bit, and maybe looking at the agenda, perhaps a little reflection on this document might help us to tie into perhaps what Meaty suggested earlier in reflecting on what happened in 2022 in the bioregional activators or bioregional catalysts. I'm just trying to think about the story of Earth regenerators and how this relates. And I don't know, I feel some pieces can get tied together. And I wanted to create the opening for that to maybe happen. Does anybody want to comment on Vivero, on Earth regenerators and its direction, on bioregional catalysts? Anything coming up? Or we're reflecting and in listening mode?
I will say, Benji, that for me, this is a crucial part of the Earth regenerators of ecosystem. I come here to be grounded in bioregion. That's my job when I come here, you know, to be grounded. I'm really happy to talk about Vivero, but I don't personally think this is the space for conversation about Vivero, except in and so far as it affects bioregion, and I don't think it's there yet. It's still in its infancy. But I would be happy to entertain Vivero conversation, but only in the context of how it supports bioregional catalyst and bioregional conversation.
Well, perhaps where we can take this from here then is because I wanted to bring in a little bit more reflection on the storytelling, and the value of continually storytelling as it pertains to fundraising. On Wednesday, I really felt that on Wednesday, I really got a deeper sense of what Joe does in the Barichara updates. Everything is evolving so rapidly, and by having a space every single week where the story can be told, coherence is continually reinforced or brought up to date. And that is really what I think enables us to do the fundraising then, is by sharing the story and in including others in the sharing of the story, inviting others to share their piece of the story. And maybe there's this part of maybe bringing Vivero into that process is a way to sort of enliven both of them. And Claire, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I think what's just coming up for me is, part of the job that I used to do was like having a media and communication strategy, and call it whatever you want to. But if, I worked in the arts and cultural space, and essentially there was a discipline to, if you want to reach a cross section of people, you know where your audiences are, who you're going to have the most impact reaching, and then and just making sure you're following up. And I'm not sure that is happening. It actually takes sort of intentional premeditation to do that. It's not just something that happens. And so it creates, it means putting a little bit of a strategy together. And I don't see it, I remember when I was first being taught like a media and communication strategy, I remember going in with a bit of, like the whole marketing thing and what have you. It's not like that at all. It's just making sure that you're effective and that people are hearing from a number of different places, cross references happening. And to be more effective, that is something that I think would be worth bringing in, because it happens more by happenstance here rather than by design. And I think it's just something to bring in as a tool.
Would anybody like to carry on from there? My internet actually went out and I think I kind of lost context a little bit. So maybe somebody else would like to respond to Claire.
I'd just like to say that could be a really interesting presentation, Claire, if you were to carve out a time, whether it's in the continuing conversation or something like that, where you do a presentation on how it is you use media to build or whatever it is to strategize. And it could be a really good way of exchanging that information.
Actually, I'll just respond just to say, I think there are a number of tools that just keep coming up, and they don't tend to come up in these conversations because they're very detail oriented and specific, and they do require, like, there's a skill set that goes with it. So maybe there is a space for kind of like what we were doing with the mapping exercises, what you were referring to, Mitty, but if there was sort of mapping story, as we acquire these tools, these skills. But to me, they're pretty essential for any of the work that I ever did in community development stuff. And it makes the difference between being effective and not. And if we don't have those, if we're not practicing those, you put a lot of energy out and it starts dissipating rather than actually being more coordinated and effective. So, and I'm happy to offer what I know, but I know there's a lot of other people that that have skills to share in those areas too.
Yeah, I might be slightly off, but I'm not an expert at all in this sphere, just sort of dabble in it. But it seems to me that the Web 3.0, the whole aspect of crypto, all those moving pieces is not very far away from some of the social media aspects. as far as I understand, particularly something like Mastodon being a decentralized system of different servers, so it doesn't have a single organizational framework. It would seem that perhaps, and again, because I have no idea what's going on in the deeper conversations of that side of Earth Regenerators, it seems to me something that we would want to be having a conversation in parallel or involving some of those people, because I think they likely have a fairly good mapping of some of the overlap of what that might look like. And that way we're doing things that are interwoven and cohesive, rather than an outlier sort of approach. And I'm probably saying this mostly because, again, I will be in this a few weeks, so I'm still trying to grasp a lot of the different moving parts within Earth Regenerators.
Yeah. So maybe this can actually be a decent segue into the last topic. Meaty wanted to discuss story of place and some of the mapping practices that we were participating in, or we were formulating at the second half of 2020. Really what I'm hearing is discussion around an ongoing practice of story of place just at multiple scales. I'm hearing the value of coherence and coordination that we would experience in making that a regular practice. And then also, if you want to tie it into the social media or relating to media, if we had greater coherence and coordination in these practices that we're constantly reifying that, then we could sort of as a community interact on social media in a way that reflects that coordination, that reflects that coherence as a group. So we've got story of place in our bioregions. We've got story of place in this planetary network as well. We're continuing to explore what's emerging, the overall ecosystem, how that ties to bioregions. Does that set context? Does anybody have anything coming up that they'd like to share? Yeah. I think that's probably where I'm going to take this fundraising call next, partly, is what does a continuing practice around storytelling look like, where we're inviting people from various parts of the ecosystem or network to share their piece with of course the focus on core teams and landscape partnerships, because ultimately that's where the most important evolution, adaptation, development takes place, is our ability to actually regenerate bioregions. That's where the groundedness, the rootedness comes in. But yeah, there's a ton of value in also bringing greater coherence and storytelling to the global scale as well. Yeah. Preston, is your hand still up from before, or you have something new to say?
I realized I had something new to say and then discovered that my hand was still up.
How convenient.
Our conversation through John earlier this week, Jan mentioned about a need for the engagement with the story locally as well. And so there's a piece of that to me that's infiltrating this part of the conversation, because all these are very tightly interwoven. People get excited about what's happening in their backyard. And at the same time, that's what engages people with financial commitment, personal commitment, and then growing that out to the larger story of, what the Great Lakes bioregion might be, particularly when you're crossing such large jurisdictional boundaries, borders, completely different frames of communities, stories, etc. So there's such a fractal aspect to this, I think, that is important. And there was I can't remember who it was questioned, is social media good for the local, or is it good for the global? And I think that's really the reality. Is it's a great tool if it's working at any level. The question is, what is the level that works for you, and how can you engage with it in a way that's productive and feels fulfilling, because so much of this never ever feels productive or fulfilling. And so, yeah, I think some guardrails to maybe have these conversations. And so, I think Claire's looking, I don't need to speak for her, but I think she's looking for a little bit of that. When you're traveling down the highway and it's very curvy and weavy, it's nice to have those security rails along the edge so that if something goes slightly wrong, you're not going deep off the end and causing a lot more harm than you intended. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Claire.
Yeah, no, you bring up something else because it does come into the communication piece, and it hasn't come up yet. And that is the layers of complexity that happen in terms of how we communicate. And I'm thinking of like the arts, and I'm thinking, in Indigenous cultures, and specifically there's an example I'm thinking of in Victoria where a totem pole was carved by many of the participants in these social programs. So it's a modern day thing where they were the participants, they were owning the story that they were part of carving, that integrated their own stories, which means that they had a sense of ownership of everything that was going on. And so they saw themselves in the story. And so that communicates very, very powerfully in a different kind of way. And so it's like these multiple ways that we are communicating, sending out the messages. And I'm thinking, when we talk about story of place, who told the story? How is the story told? Is it okay for the story to be told by certain people? Like all those things. It starts to just kind of open that up. It's not just about going and listening for the story of place. It's like that's so one-dimensional in many ways. So it's to me, it's like thinking in terms of like, how do we help weave the rich complexity of what we're really dealing with? And the other aspect where you bring the arts in, it's an embodied way of hearing too, of communicating. So yeah, I just really wanted to bring those layers of complexity that I think I would really, I think this is a conversation that would be good looking at.
Well, I'm sorry, Claire, what was that last part? This conversation would be good for what?
Oh, just looking at it at a multidimensional way of how we look at it. It's not, it can't just be one thing or another. It's how they all weave and interconnect. Because the Twitter stories are the thing that connects to the other thing that helps you understand, and that embodied understanding is what helps you hear the Twitter story differently than you would, Yeah.
I think I've got a framing that I use anyways to situate story of place into all this complexity, and I'm going to bring it in, and I hope it doesn't confuse things, but the Bioregional Learning Center. Story of place fits into the Bioregional Learning Center. Story of place helps us to make sense of the history of our place, the ecological realities, how they come up to the present, where we're going into the future. Bioregional learning centers are basically the cultural containers or the sense-making containers that hold all the complexity and evolution, and at multiple scales. I'm getting some nods, so I figured that'd be a little risky because it's not super clear in my mind, but it's all bioregional learning centers, and they scale up. They're fractal as well, right? Like we have ecological learning processes, or sorry, landscape scale learning processes. We have regional scale learning processes, continental scale learning processes, planetary scale learning processes. It's just a way for humans to understand our own evolution and how that ties into our place and various scales. I don't know if, so the learning, so the story of place, we never really stopped exploring it or stopped practicing it. We had that conversation a couple weeks ago on bioregional learning centers, and sorry about the helicopter. And I think that, story of place is going to find its place in these conversations very often, and it's not going to look the same every time. It's going to be it's going to happen at different scales. And yeah, there's a lot of subtlety in this conversation. Meaty, please.
A question is coming up in me. It's forming. It's been sitting, trying to find words for a little while. The word centre, Bioregional Learning Centre. I see you nodding, Benji. I found myself thinking, if it was called a bioregional ecoversity, would I relate differently to it? What's this whole notion of centre? I've been thinking a lot about centre since Penny shared her map. There's only one change that I personally would make to Penny's map, although I'm not sure how far the map currently reflects the reality and the minutiae of some parts of Earth Regenerators. But for me, that map was so useful in learning what is the Joe, Penny, and presumably Benji perspective on bioregional activators and where it links into Earth Regenerators. And the only piece of Earth Regenerators that the map that I would change at the moment is the notion of the culture center in the center. And that's because of the experience I had with Trisha and some other people, with Annalika in the constellation, the ER constellation workshop, where something really important happened at the moment at which the facilitator created space in the center. And there's something for me about the center is where the sacred enters in. The sacred is where, oh gosh, I'm going to make this very complex. And if it doesn't make sense, bear with me. Part of the challenge for me of mapping is that we're always trying to put the hologram world into here it is, a two-dimensional space. And really what we're looking at here is a hologram where every part of the piece has an aspect of every other part of the piece within itself. I don't think the culture center does sit in the center of the ER network. I think the culture center is another center, another circle, another lozenge or whatever that sits at the edge, and the center is where each part of the whole comes into prominence momentarily as it steps forward to take a lead. So something might happen in bioregional piece here that is momentarily leading the ER network and has an impact on every other part of the network. And then the flow shifts, and it's whatever's going on in the culture center when Gail Burkett and colleagues hold a celebration ceremony at solstice or equinox that impacts the whole field of Earth Regenerators, however visibly or invisibly. And then the wave moves on to, and suddenly it's the ER Fund group that met this morning and was considering its relationship to Vivero and the bigger governance group that's come into being that is now out here holding the membrane of ER network. And it's this whole thing for me about the challenge of every time we commit a map of the territory to two-dimensional space, that it is it's so much less than the sum of all its parts. And yet it's what we work with. It helps, and at the same time it obscures, it clarifies, and at the same time it obscures. Forgive me, this is just an in the moment presencing of the many strands that are circulating in MIDI as a result of this highly stimulating conversation. And it feels important conversation. And I put my hand down and invite Claire to bring some clarity to the miasma of MIDI, the MIDI miasma.
Well, I just felt like I just needed to respond briefly to the Culture Center piece. I would say that the Culture Center it's been a small group and capacity has been an issue. So but what it represents for me is holding the sacred. And to me, what holds the sacred absolutely needs to be the thing that you keep at the center, because it's what holds everything else in a place where that fractal process will be held in right relationship. And so that to me is what the representation of the Culture Center, imperfect as it is, that's the attempt of what that is. So
if I could just respond to that, it's so beautiful what I hear you say, Claire. And it so reinforces for me why the body within Earth Regenerators that calls itself the Culture Center should be at the side, because at a moment, the sacred may be sitting in here in bioregional catalysts. At a moment, it may be the ER fund and the money that is suddenly the sacred. And it enables, if the center space is empty, it enables the sacred to come in and be embodied by whichever part of the system in the moment is relevant. And that for me is what a hologram is, as a living, breathing, dynamic, ever-evolving being. Thank you.
Trisha, over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's super stimulating. I just wanted to bring in also the thing around Bioregional Learning Center, kind of within a story, which is the physical place that that Higadonis occupies right now was formerly a bilingual multicultural elementary school focused on environmental education. But the thing was, the students were going there every day to learn, and were actually not going out into the actual environment and learning with nature. And one of the things that gets me a little well, there's a few things when we focus on like a bioregional learning center as a place. And one is, how do we ensure that the place does not supersede sometimes our discomfort that we have being out in nature? You know, either the sadness that can arise, or the grief that can arise, or the fear that can arise, and instead focus on the kind of intellectualization of our bioregion, as opposed to the full embodiment of who we are in relationship with the nature that surrounds us. And then the other part of it that feels kind of a little bit nebulous is that, what if there's a community that doesn't have access to a place? And then they feel like, oh, well, we have to get a center before we can really call ourselves a bioregional learning center, as opposed to, you know, wherever you wind up meeting, wherever you wind up having your campfire or having your bioregional walk, like that's where your center is. Your center is embodied in the people that are embodying themselves as bioregional learners. And then the other aspect of it is that like when I look at my bioregion here, it's like, yes, Los Higuerones is a bioregional learning center for specific aspects of the bioregion. We also have a public library that's a bioregional learning center for other aspects of the bioregion. We also have a farmers co-op that's a bioregional learning center. So I think, you know, using the terminology in its loosest way is really very important, because as we all know, language is super important. So I'll just leave it at that. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Trisha. I think that was really well stated. And if I could just really briefly plug the invitation that I put out at the end of the Bioregional Learning Center workshop we did a couple weeks ago, where I invited bioregions to come together and host workshops in each of their places respectively, where they're just going out onto the land and they are having a dialogue on what bioregional learning is, and they're first off mapping or having a discussion of the existing regenerative projects in the space, regenerative people, and anything else that might feel pertinent or useful to discuss and to map together. And then have a conversation about, well, what are the landscape functions here? Let's map those out a little bit. And let's also think about the people who we might invite into the conversation who could bring a whole lot more clarity to how the landscape functions, that people that can help us to understand this place better. And then also express with the people who are participating in that workshop that is a bioregional learning center. They don't have to have a place. They don't have to have a center to get this all started. And so I've actually, if anybody is interested in hosting that workshop in your place, please reach out to me, because I'm trying to actually coordinate a few different bioregions to go through this together to prototype or experiment how this the value in doing this in parallel. And it's something that I wanted to actually hold space to then present on in like a month or two, or, you know, whenever we get organized. So if anybody wants to do that, be part of that, please reach out to me. And so thank you, Trisha, for that inspiration. And with that, we have about 15 seconds left. If everybody could just unmute and say how you're feeling, one word, all in unison. I don't know how it's going to work. I think it worked all right when we did it a couple weeks ago, but I'm going to count down from 5. All right. I'll give you 5 seconds to figure out what your word is, and then just share it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Grateful.
Busy.
Loving.
And thank you.
Oh, Rich.
That worked pretty good. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for
Appreciate
hosting,
ya.
Betty.
Thank you, Claire,
Everyone.
for
Bye.
coming.
Thank you.
See some of you
Bye.
tomorrow.